Good day, everyone. I am Janet Merivera, and today I will tell you about the effects of non-performance in pure obligations. First, we have breach of obligation. So, in cases of non-performance or delay, the debtor may be held liable for damages. Next, we have remedies for creditors. Demand for performance. Since the obligation is demandable at once, the creditor can immediately demand fulfillment of the obligation. Next, we have judicial action. Should the debtor fail to perform, the creditor may take the matter to court to compel performance or recover damages. And lastly, we have right to damages. In cases where specific performance is no longer viable or reasonable, the creditor may seek compensation for damages resulting from non-compliance. So those are the four non-performance in pure obligations. First, we have breach obligation, remedies for creditors, judicial action, and right to damages. Next, we have pure and conditional obligations. A conditional obligation is one whose existence or extinction depends on the occurrence or non-occurrence of a future and uncertain event, which is known as the condition. There are two types of condition. One is suspension condition. Two is resolutory condition. So, the suspensive condition, the obligation arises only upon the fulfillment of the condition. Example, I will give you my laptop if you pass the accountancy board exam. That is an example of suspensive condition. Next, we have resolutory condition. The obligation is extinguished upon the fulfillment of the condition. Example, I will give you my laptop. But if you fail the accountancy board exam, you must return it.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Attorney Heidi Papuro. For today's video, I'll be discussing the classification based on certainty and timing. So, for today's video, I'll be discussing the three conditions. First condition is possible versus impossible conditions. So, possible condition. This condition is a conditions that can happen based on the nature of events or actions. So, for example, the example is if Maria submits her job application before the deadline, she'll be considered for the position. Why? This condition is possible because Maria is a control over submitting her application, and deadlines are real constraints. There is nothing in this condition that defines logic or natural laws. So that is the example of possible conditions. So let's move on for the impossible conditions. Impossible condition is condition that cannot happen. Under Article 11A3, an obligation based on impossible condition is generally void. However, if the condition is purely accidental or non-essential to the main contract, the obligation may be still valid. So, for example, impossible conditions. So, for example of impossible condition is if a human can live without oxygen for a year, they will inherit the property. Why? This is impossible because human biologically required oxygen to survive. Since no one can fulfill this condition, the contract or agreement tied up to it becomes void from the start. In legal principles in contract law, Article 11A3 in some legal system, if an obligation depends on the impossible condition, the obligation itself does not take effect. So that was a example of impossible condition. So let's move forward for the number 2 conditions. So the second condition is positive and negative condition. So the positive condition requires the happening of an event. For example, if it rains tomorrow, the positive occurrence of rains will fulfill the conditions. So another example of a positive condition is if John wins the marathon, he will receive a sponsorship deal. This condition is positive because it depends on the event happening, which is winning the marathon. The sponsorship will only to activate if the event occurs. So that was is one of the example of positive condition. So let's move forward for the negative condition. So the negative condition is it requires the non-happening of an event such as if a buyer does not obtain a loan by the end of the month. So that was a negative condition. The example is if Lisa does not fail in a subject this semester, her parents will buy her a car. So this condition is negative because it depends on event not happening, which is failing the subject. If Lisa fails any one subject, the condition is broken, and she won't receive the car. So the difference between the positive condition is focuses on something happening, while the negative condition is focuses on something not happening. So that was a my example of the negative and positive condition. So let's move forward for another condition. So another condition is divisible condition. If the condition can be partially fulfilled, like payment and installment, the effects are proportionate to each fulfillment. So my example this one is if the construction company complete 25% of the project, they will receive 25% of the payment. So this condition is divisible because each part of the task complete leads to the corresponding benefits. Like in real world relevance, many contracts and business use milestone based payment, meaning payments happen in portions, not all at once. So that was my example. So lastly, the condition that I will discuss is indivisible condition. This condition is cannot be partially fulfilled, like building a house in a lot. The entry obligation depends to the fulfillment of the conditions. Like for example, if the writer finished the entire book, they will receive the full payment. So this condition is divisible because it requires the 100% completion before the benefits, which is the full payment, is guaranteed. So the key ideas of this is no partial credit. It's all nothing. It's all or nothing. So in the real world relevance, this happens in creative industries like books, movies, industries, where the final product must be completed before the reward is given, which is the full payment or the money that they given to you. So this is my example of my last condition, which is the indivisible condition. That's all.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, classmates. My topic is a classification of condition based on uncertainty and timing. There are three major of this condition. First is the casual, second is positive condition, the third is mixed condition. First is the casual condition. It's one that depends entirely on chance, nature, on a third party's action. The fulfillment of the condition is uncertain because it does not depends on either party's win. It is an external factor that decides whether the conditions happens. The second is positive condition. This condition is one that depends on will or action of one of the contracting parties. There are two into divided. First is the valid positive condition. This based on the party's effort of performance. The second is the invalid positive condition. If based purely on the debtor's declaration, making the contract uncertain. The third is the mixed condition. This condition is partially depends on the will of one party and partially of an external factor. The fulfillment of the condition is the uncertain because it involves both personal effort and chance external approval. Thank you.
Effect of conditions on the parties' rights. First is the suspensive condition fulfillment. It means that an obligation only takes effect once a specific event happens. It means that The condition must to fulfill first before the obligation turn into legal. For example, a buyer agrees to buy a house only if their loan application is approved. If this will approve, the contract will take effect. And if not, the contract does not bind either party. It means that the loan must be approved first before the contract will take effect. And if not, the contract does not take effect and both parties are not obligated. Second is the failure of a suspensive condition. It means that if a suspensive condition does not materialize, the obligation does not take effect and parties have no duties under the agreement. It means if the condition does not happen, the obligation never takes effect and neither party has any legal duties under the agreement. And the both parties are not bound to perform anything. Third is the resolutory condition. It means that an existing obligation ends if a specific event happens. For example, a company grants an employee a scholarship, provided they work for the company for 5 years. If the employee resigns early, the scholarship obligation ends and they may have to repay the funds. It means that the company gave scholarship to one of the employee in condition that he or she will work in the company for 5 years. And if the employer resigns before 5 years, the scholarship obligation ends and he or she may have to repay the funds. Fourth is the retroactive effect. It means that when a suspensive condition is met, the legal effects apply retroactively or as if the obligation existed from the start. For example, if a contract states that a car's ownership will transfer only once full payment is made, once pay is completed, the buyer may be considered the owner from the date of agreement, not just from the payment date. It says that the buyer considered as the owner once the payment is completed from the date of the agreement. There have also effects of loss, deterioration, or improvement, Articles 1189 to 1190. First is the loss before fulfillment of condition. It means that if an object is destroyed due to an unforeseen event, before the suspensive condition is met, the obligation is cancelled. For example, a seller agrees to sell a painting only if a museum agrees to display it. If the painting is destroyed before the museum decides, the contract is void. It means that if the painting is damaged before the museum can make a decision, the contract will be void. Second is the deterioration of the object. It means that the obliged must accept the object in its deteriorated state. For example, a seller agrees to sell a rare book if the buyer secures funding. If the book gets damaged due to the seller's negligence before the funding is secured, the buyer can either back out or proceed with compensation. Third is the improvement of the object. It means that if the object improves while the condition is pending, the benefit goes to the obliged without extra cost. For example, a landowner promises to sell a plot of land once zoning approval granted. If the government builds a new road that increases the land's value before approval, the buyer still gets the benefit of the improved land. It means that the government built a new road. That's why the value of the land increases. But even the value of the land increases, the seller still need to sell it to the buyer at their agreed price.
Good day everyone, I'm Princess Mebulawan and I will discuss the rights of the parties pending fulfillment of the condition. So first is conditional creditor's rights. Under a suspensive condition, the creditor has a mere expectancy or insurance right over the obligation. So, so a creditor right to demand fulfillment of a deal is suspended until a specific condition is met. Although they have a future rights, it isn't enforceable until then, but they do have a legal protection to ensure their rights are recognized once the condition is fulfilled. Next is the conditional debtor's rights. The debtor is not obligated to perform the obligation until the condition is fulfilled and generally cannot be complied to do so. So a debtor is not obligated to fulfill their part of the agreement until the specified condition occurs. They cannot be forced to act before the condition is met. So next is uh, the effects of anticipated fulfillment of condition. If the parties agree to fulfill the condition ahead of a schedule, the obligation may take effect immediately. So, if the both parties agree, they can complete the deal early even if the condition hasn't been fulfilled. This requires mutual consent and must be legally valid, ensuring that neither parties feel pressured to act um, prematurely. So so next is remedies and enforcement under conditional uh, obligation. First is the performance and enforcement. When a creditor is fulfilled, the obligation becomes enforceable by law. So, once the condition is met, the obligation becomes legally binding and enforceable. This means the parties are now required to fulfill their respective parts of the agreement. So next is the um, rescission or cancellation. If the condition fails to or a resolutory condition fulfilled, parties may seek to rescind the contract potentially with damages or restitution. If the condition fails or resolutory condition is fulfilled, either either party can terminate the contract. This could involve seeking the compensation for damages or restitution. Next is the uh, claim for damages. If the obligor action or negligence prevents the fulfillment of a suspensive condition, the obligee was claim damages for the lost obligation. If the parties' action prevent the fulfillment of the suspensive condition, the other parties can claim damages for the resulting loss. For example, if the seller fails to provide a necessary permit, preventing the buyer from completing the purchase, the buyer could sue for damages caused by the delay or inability to complete the purchase.
Obligations with period. A period is a certain length of time which determines the effectivity or the extinguish of obligations. So, in short, this means that a period has a length of time from the beginning to an end. For example, a year period, 1 year period. So, from January to December. So, that is the period. So, now let's differentiate the period from a condition. So, first, in their fulfillment. A condition is an uncertain event, but a period is an event which must happen sooner or later, at a date known beforehand, or a time which cannot be determined. So, from this statement, it said that a period is something that must happen sooner or later, and the condition is an uncertain event, so we cannot predict it when will it gonna happen. So, second, with reference to time. A period always refers to the future. A condition may, under the law, refer event to the past. So from this statement, it is said that a period will always refer to the future. So, for example, now is the beginning of the period, and when I finish this video, that is the end, which means that is the future of the period. While the condition is under a law, refer to even the past. So they have a basis. A condition have a basis to of the past to do something. So third is as to influence on the obligations. So a condition causes an obligation to arise or to cease. So this means that condition is the root of obligations. So it can cause to arise the obligations or to cease the obligations. While a period merely flags the time or the consciousness of an obligation. So let's go to requisites for a valid period or term. First, it must refer to the future. Like I said before, a period will always refer to the future, not in the past. Second, it must be certain or be sure to come, but can be extended if eliminated subsequently by mutual agreement. The obligations become pure and immediately demandable. Third is it must be physical and legally possible. Otherwise, the obligations is void. For example, I'll give you my house 1 year after your death. The obligations here is void. So let's go to kinds of terms. So first is ex die, a short term or period which has suspensive effect, which means the obligation becomes effectively only from the arrival of a certain day. So from this statement, it said that the obligations only become if the arrival day arrived or a certain day arrived, which means the final day or the target day will arrive. So for example, Joey promises to support Rachel from the death of Rachel's father, which means that the obligation only begins from the death of Rachel's father. In diem, a term or period with a resolutory effect, which means that the obligation will subsist up to a certain day and it terminates upon the arrival of that day. So basically, Joey promised to support Rachel until Rachel reaches her majority age, which means that the obligation is already effective but will terminate once Rachel turns 18. So that's the end of the promise period. Effect of period. Obligations with a term are demandable only when a day fixed for their performance arrive. Those in actions for the recovery of debts payable in installments, those not yet due, and payable cannot be demanded in the complainant.
I am Lojin Mitiwario, and my topic is all about alternative and facultative obligation. So, what is alternative and facultative obligations? In the context of legal obligations, an alternative obligation allows to the debtor to fulfill obligations by performing one of several prestation. But while um, facultative obligation only obligates the debtor to perform one specific prestation, but they can substitute it with one another. So, definition of this is in alternative obligations, the debtor is bound to perform of one several prestations. It's either actions or deliveries, but fulfilling any one of them discharges the entire obligations. So, um, there are three types of practical application for alternative obligation. First, supply contracts. Second, service contracts. Lastly, debt obligations. So, what is supply contracts? Supply contracts is all about a supplier may have the option to provide alternative products of the originally agreed upon product is available. So second, service contracts. Service contracts is all about contractor may offer alternative methods of fulfilling service obligation. Lastly, the debt obligations. A debtor may offer alternative forms of payment or satisfaction to the creditors. So, there are example of alternative obligation. For example of alternative obligation, where the debtor is obligated to deliver. O so, moto kong giingon nga, ang alternative gyud kay specific gyud sila nga mo deliver sa item either kaning car or specific motorcycle mo na yang akong example. To fulfilling either delivery satisfies the obligations for the creditors. So, mo gyud na ang kwan sa alternative. Then for facultative obligation, my example is obligation. For example, Bain owes Billy a car. So, mo na ang obligation. Then, ang facultative ani is Billy, the debtor is obligated to deliver the car, but he can choose to deliver a motorcycle instead, even though the motorcycle was not originally part of the agreement. So, moto akong gingon nga ang facultative is pwede siya ma-substitute sa uban. Kana bitaw mapasa siya sa uban bitaw. There. That's all. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I am Emerjoy D. Lavadilla. Determinate versus generic obligations. In obligations to deliver, a determinate thing is specifically identified, while a generic thing is defined by its class or kind, with the creditor having different rights and remedies depending on the type of obligation. So, determinate obligation means you must deliver a specific thing that is clearly identified. No other item can replace it. So, in generic obligation means you must deliver something of a certain kind but not a specific item. You can choose any item that fits the description. Determinate specific thing. A determinate thing is a specific, particularized object indicated by its own individually. Example, a specific car with a particular VIN number or a specific painting by a certain artist. That is the example of determinate specific thing. In generic indeterminate thing is a generic thing is one whose determination is confined to that of its nature, to the genus or genero to which it pertains, such as horse, a chair. Example of this is a bag of rice or a certain type of computer. So, a determinate obligation involves a specific identifiable thing or service. Example of this, a contract to sell a specific painting by a particular artist. The painting is unique and cannot be replaced by another painting. So that is the determinate obligations. A generic obligation involves a thing or service that is identified only by its class or genus. The object is not specific, and any item from that class can fulfill the obligation. That is generic obligation. Example of this is a contract to buy 100 kilograms of rice. The rice is not specified, but any 100 kilograms of rice of a reasonable quality will satisfy the obligation. So a determinate obligation refers to something that is clearly identified and unique. It cannot be replaced by another of the same kind. For example, if someone buys a specific painting by a famous artist, they expect the exact artwork, not just any painting by the same artist. On the other hand, a generic indeterminate obligation refers to something that belongs to a category or type without being uniquely identified. It can be replaced by another item of the same kind. That is the generic indeterminate obligation. For example of this is if someone buys a certain type of computer, they just need any unit of that model, not a specific one. In short, determinate things are unique and irreplaceable, while generic things are replaceable as long as they fit the description. That is the ang kalahian sa determinate things and generic things. So, determinate versus generic obligations. That determinate is deliver a determinate or specific thing, particularly designated or physical segregated. That is the determinate. While generic is deliver an indeterminate or generic thing, and without any particular designation or physical segregation. That is the generic. So, a determinate obligation is when a person is required to deliver a specific, clearly identified thing. That is the determinate obligation. While a generic obligations, on the other hand, is when the person is required to deliver something of a certain kind but not a specific item. That is the generic obligation.
Breach occur when the obligor fails to fulfill their duty, leading to the non-performance, incomplete performance, or faulty performance of the obligor. Breach can arise from default. The obligor fails to perform the obligation on time. occur when an obligor, the party responsible for fulfilling an obligation, fails to perform their duty within the agreed time frame. Second, Fred Dolo. There is an intentional decide of or malice in failing to perform the obligation. Example, this happened before or at the time of contract formation if proven to contract can be annulled because the consent was obtained through deception. Third is negligence culpa, failure to perform due to lack of due care. Culpa refers to negligence of fault where a person fails to exercise the proper level of care in fulfilling an obligation, unlike dolo which involve intentional deceit or bad faith. Culpa results from carelessness, lack of foresight, or imprudence. Lastly, fortuitous event. The parties agreed otherwise in the contract and obligor was already in default before the event occurred. The nature of the obligation requires assuming the rest. And remedies for breach of obligation. Example, rescission, resolution. Emily buys a laptop from a store but is defective. Emily seeks rescission, canceling the contract and returning the laptop for a full refund. And also the damage. David hires a contractor to build an extension on his house. The contractor fails to complete the work on time, causing David to incur additional costs. Withholding performance. An example, Alex agrees to deliver goods to Ben in exchange of payment. Ben fails to make the payment. Alex withholds delivery of the goods until Ben complies with his obligation to pay. Example of interest. Rachel needs $10 to her friends Mike with a 6% interest rate and repayment term of 1 year. Penalty cost. A company hires a freelance writer to produce content within a tight deadline. The contract includes a penalty cost for late delivery $1,000 per day. Another is defense of the debtor in breach situation. First measure. If the breach was due to the unforeseen, unfavorable event, the debtor may be relieved of responsibility. Many contracts include a force majeure clause which specifies the type of event, that quality, and what happens if they occur. If a force majeure event happens, the affected party may be relieved of responsibility. Then, proof of performance of compliance is a legal defense used by a debtor to demonstrate that they indeed meet their contractual obligation instead of merely denying the breach. The debtor activity provide evidence showing that they acted according to the contract.
Okay, for my topic, I will discuss the joint versus solidary obligation. So what are those? So those are a legal concept that describe how multiple individuals share responsibility for a debt or duty. While both were involved, share responsibility, so they differ in how the creditor can collect payment and how the debtor are responsible to each other. So first, we have the joint obligations. So what is that? It means that a joint obligation is a multiple individuals that are jointly liable for the entire debt or duty. However, the creditor must collect the entire amount from all debtors together. So for example, is shared lease. So example, there are two friends that rent an apartment together. So they have a joint obligation to pay the rent. So, if one friend fails to pay their share, since they have a joint obligation, then the landlord can only sue both together for the full rent amount. And then, okay, so second example. Example, a co-signing a loan. It means a limited liability. So, example. So, two friends. So, there are two friends. It's Lisa and Mark. So, they co-sign a loan for Lisa's new car. So, the loan agreement specifies that they are jointly liable for the loan. Means that they're jointly liable. However, there are agreement also states that Mark's liability is limited to a specific amount. So, if Lisa defaults or fail to pay on the loan, so Mark is only responsible for the agreed upon amount. Okay, so we also have the characteristic of joint obligation. So first is the creditor can sue all debtors together. Then second is that each debtor is only liable for their proportionate share of the debt. Then last is that if one debtor is unable to pay, the creditor can only collect from the remaining debtors for their proportionate share.